Okay, John, you can start the meeting.
Thank you for joining us. I am John Sarushian, the Associate Director for Corporate Governance and Technology at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Today, we're going to talk about the tremendous potential artificial intelligence has to accelerate innovation. Currently, AI tools are being deployed for research and development across various industries, universities, and governments. AI tools have also become critical in the fight against COVID-19 as they are being used to help stop the spread and find a cure for the pandemic. This morning, we have three distinguished guests to talk about these issues. Anish Chopra, and Anish, I'm going to ask you to wave your hand. Anish Chopra is the former Chief Technology Officer of the United States and the current president of CareJourney. Carla Cartwright is the Director of Global Regulatory Policy at Johnson & Johnson. And finally, Mark Walsh is the Managing Director of Ruxton Ventures and on the board of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you all for joining. Before we begin Q&A, I am going to ask the audience to submit any questions they have via the Zoom Q&A function, and we will try to get to those in the last 15 minutes of the panel discussion. So thank you everyone who's tuned in. And with that, Anish, first question's for you. As the former CTO for the federal government, what would you like to say about the use of AI for fighting the pandemic? And do you have any specific advice for your successor and his team at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy?
John, thank you for having me. And my prayers are out to the families who are struggling during this public health crisis. And first, acknowledgement to the frontline workers who are doing heroic work. Let me answer your question in three parts. One is a bit of a stock taking for those who are trying to keep track of what we're doing today as a matter of public policy. Second, to reflect a bit about some of the limitations and thus maybe lead into some of the possibilities. First, and I think right out of the gate, the current CTO, Michael Kratsios, did what you would need to have happen in a moment like this as it relates to artificial intelligence, and that is to release data. Artificial intelligence are tools that are applied against data sets. And in an emerging crisis like the like we have in the oh, that's my background there. I also know what that is. The point is you need access to the data. So early, the CTO released tens of thousands, 20,000+ data sets on research articles that are historically accessible through paywalls, or you must have months of delay to get information out. The presumption was, let's get preprint articles available immediately. This allowed researchers in China who were studying what was happening in Wuhan, who were publishing early findings on clinical characteristics, to share that information. And I would say in an immediately useful way, the CTO negotiated and organized the release of those data sets that would help train any number of models led by government response as well as private sector response. So point number one, release the data. Second area that the CTO, I think to his credit, launched was the matchmaking of folks that have interest in the data and maybe a few hypotheses to test, but lack access to the computing power. John, today, artificial intelligence resources are constrained to those that can afford and manage them. The disconnect is that there are plenty of people in the public health community that have questions or hypotheses. They may not be trained or have access to those tools. So the second step was to release the computing capacity and to match it in a more coherent way to those that need it. And so he announced a public-private partnership to open up more of those tools. But now we get to the limitations, John, and here's the sad reality. We know very little about the COVID challenges in the United States. And I say that in a slightly embarrassed way, in that we've gone through this after 9/11. We made investments to improve our public health infrastructure. After H1N1, we put another focus on it. And yet when you take a look at the results, it was Wednesday, about 2 weeks ago, that the Centers for Disease Control published the very first batch of statistics on the 4,000 plus cases of COVID-19 in the US. And the headline of the story was to share what we pretty much had known from overseas. The older you are, the more chronically ill you are, the higher the likelihood that you would suffer a fatal outcome. But the footnote in the publication is what gave me some great concern. Of the 4,000 reported cases to the CDC, a third of them did not include in the case report whether or not the patient was hospitalized.
Wow.
47% did not report whether the patient had been admitted to the ICU. In nearly half the cases, there was no indication as to whether the patient died or not.
Wow.
And then even something as basic or rudimentary as the age of the person that tested positive or was a suspected condition was absent in 9% of the forms. And you saw in the more recent emails that have been made available through the ProPublica effort, a scramble to find people that can interpret phone calls and fax machine reports to manually key in the data, which acknowledges that you can't apply these tools if you don't have access to the underlying information.
Right.
So what it suggests to me with ways in which we might think about this moving forward, I think number one, the understanding that we've just spent, a decade digitizing the healthcare system.
Right.
We've clearly fallen short on public health, and we need to have a thorough understanding as to why. Why is it that we are phoning and faxing in public health statistics when, since midpoint of the electronic health records program, we mandated data feeds go from hospitals straight to the public health community? Why that fell short or wasn't properly deployed or not optimized? Those are questions. We need to start thinking about rapid learning, and a big part of the AI story is understanding the questions that you'd want to pose. So long before you throw tools at a problem, you'd want to have an understanding about the nature of the problem. So what is the nature of this disease progression? Who actually is getting sick and who might be already immune? What are some of the variables that drive whether someone needs to be admitted to the hospital or can recover at home, or who needs an ICU bed or a ventilator? These important resource allocation decisions, we need to have questions and information that respond to those questions more rapidly fielded. So my recommendation is the following. Number one, that we put public health first on the set of use cases that we tap when it comes to the most recent interoperability rules. We normally think about interoperability about doctors, and we even put the rule that patients should have access to their data. We've had a lot of debate about who gets access and under what circumstance. I think an important variable going forward is going to be, can we double, triple check that the public health infrastructure has access to the very same information that you and I can share on our health records via tools like Apple Health? Once we've got better access to the data and hopefully more democratized computing capacity, which I think will happen naturally, then I think the linkage between the questions and the tools map to that loop goes, I think, as we see the next chapter of our public health response, if that's helpful, John.
That was very helpful and a very sobering assessment, talking about sort of the data needs, computing needs, asking the right question, all very important points. And Carla, I'm going to bring you in a similar question, maybe with more focus on Johnson & Johnson. So what is being done using AI to fight the pandemic, and what maybe can the government do to help in this regard?
Thanks, John, for the question. And I'd like to thank BPC for having me here, and thank everyone for joining a webinar during these very challenging times. I hope everyone did see yesterday that Johnson & Johnson announced that we have identified a target, and it was through access to great data and the ability to work with what was made available that's made that possible. And we're very excited about continuing that partnership with BARDA and those efforts. And so I am really aligned with what John has said, what Anish has said about needing the access to the data. You know, we can use AI for drug development, we can use it for discovery, but all of that hinges on having access to the data. And so it's so important, if we are able to access the data, that we can use it to identify the best targets, to speed up the way those targets intercept are intercepted, and identifying the right molecules to effectively modulate the targets and things like that. But again, that all hinges on having the data to facilitate the use of the AI. We're also using AI throughout the sort of development process, and in ways that we think will help speed development up. We can use it to monitor clinical trials, to develop digital flags in clinical trials, to determine trial feasibility, which is obviously critical when you're in a global pandemic and people are not able to get to you know, a healthcare provider, and they don't necessarily want to leave their homes to have, you know, a blood draw and things like that. So it's so important for things like remote patient monitoring, recruitment, consent, finding the right patients. And all of those are things that are particularly critical when you're dealing with this kind of a time constraint. And so, you know, again, having the access to the data is really important. One thing I want to underscore about what Anish was saying in terms of just having access to the data and the feasibility of making it available in these sort of public health settings is also that this needs to happen globally. We are dealing with, you know, CCPA and GDPR and laws in all different countries that are, you know, well-intentioned to protect patients and their healthcare rights and their healthcare data, which is very sensitive. But we need to, in a time like this, think about how we can harmonize those approaches so that we can really get the full benefit of the data coming from different countries. And that's something that we're grappling with as a large, you know, multinational company that's trying to deal with the pandemic.
Great, thank you. Very important, points and interesting stuff you guys are doing. Next question is for Mark. Mark, you are an investor, and the economy has been a hot topic right now, given the emergency measures being taken by governments, you know, internationally and domestically. Two-part question for you, because we want to link this to broader AI-driven economic activity. So part one, where do you see the economy going in the short term, given the pandemic and the government's response? And part two, where do you see the economy going long term, given sort of the potential AI has for fostering economic growth?
Well, I think you invited the wrong guy, because I'm not an economist, but I play one on TV. But I'll give a couple of perspectives that occur to me as a venture investor and small business startup investment orientation that I've had in my career, and particularly in tech, but that I think it applies to a lot of smaller businesses. But before I get to the points of your question one and two, as far as short and long term, I just want to remind the folks that are listening that the opening comments by Carla and Anish are really important. I don't think anybody should just, you know, think this is another video session where we're hearing some experts talk. I think those are two extraordinarily important addresses. And if I could, just on one point, I think both of them are talking about things that need to be done, have to be done. Shockingly, we're not done, and we need to prepare for the future, because COVID-19 is the beginning of, I think, multiple chapters in all of our lives. I'm in the risk group now. I'm the oldest person on this panel, so I specifically am more concerned about it. But I think we'll talk a little bit later about the collision between privacy and what needs to be done. I think both Carla and Anish, if you listen to them carefully, we're effectively talking about that. And I think that's going to be an interesting point going forward, because sometimes policy is made in the heat of the moment and its impact is not felt till later. And some of these sort of battlefield policy decisions that are being made domestically and I think around the world will need to reevaluate. But let's get to the economy. So a phrase that's often used in 2008 in the global financial crisis and in some other arenas is a V-shaped recovery. You know, that's the quintessential sort of visions of sugar plums dancing in your head Santa moment, where the market says, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible, but we're going to have a quick recovery, and there's money to be made when the various indices and individual stocks come back and stuff like that." I don't think there's a V-shaped recovery in the short term here. If you looked at jobless claims, I think it was 8x the last record, which was in 1982, or perhaps even a more dramatic multiple of that. Look at service industries. I recommend that everybody on this listening to this conference Google Arne Sorensen, the CEO of Marriott. He gave a speech on LinkedIn, a video to all Marriott employees and everybody, talking about what Marriott Corporation's experience is. And you can imagine they're down something like 85 or 90%. They're going to have to relieve a significant chunk of their workforce. Macy's announced 125,000 employees. Probably the great majority of them are going to be let go immediately. You know, these are major brand names in both domestic and global businesses that are completely decimated. So it's impossible for me to consider that there will be a V-shaped recovery. There may be a V-shaped recovery for some equities in some indices, in some arenas, when things come back to quote normal unquote. But I don't see any recovery in the short term, even for the smaller business or sort of venture investing stuff that I'm talking about. I think longer term, second and final point, longer term, there's going to be a recovery, but it's not going to look like what we expect recoveries to look like. I happen to think, I'm a bit of a sort of a science fiction guy, but I happen to think this is a realignment moment for the next 6 to 9 months of a wide variety of industries that we sort of took for granted beforehand. And I don't mean like, you know, the automotive industry or the hospitality industry or the restaurant industry. Those are 3 of them probably. But I think there's going to be a realignment of a wide variety of things that we took for granted as citizens. And the one that I think is probably going to be most realigned is government. I think that we're seeing a schism between state government and federal government behavior that is going to be very difficult to heal. I don't care who wins in 2020. And I think we're also going to see the fact that some states behave in a certain way and some states behave in another way. Whether there'll be some migration to states that seem to be a little more mature or forward thinking in their reaction to this versus those that were not. So I think both federal, state, and even local government may have some realignment in an economic recovery over the longer term. The weird thing is that, to the point of your question, the short versus the long term has been also compressed. I mean, you look at, you know, the old long-term elements of economic forecasting were 3, 5, 10, 20 years. I think we're talking sort of, you know, 90 days versus not 90 days. And I think that's where a division lies as well. But I hope that answers your question.
That was helpful. And long-term being 90 days, that's kind of an interesting prospect.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to Anish. Carlos sort of talked about the international component of, you know, responding to the pandemic, data sharing. How do you see international coordination? Are we doing enough? What can we do better going forward? And what can we do long-term, both with regards to the pandemic and then AI issues more broadly?
Well, I mean, you know, I always think in threes, and I would say at the outset there remains. Of course, we can do more, and let's. Much of the data that was released in the beginning was because of a global commitment to sharing. There's more that can be done in understanding the South Korea intervention, why it seemed to have sort of slowed down or flattened the curve more effectively. There's been, you know, there's a set of policy issues. Mark described the privacy issues. How did they strike the balance between more digital contact tracing, you know, getting your cell records, trying to anonymize, but then making it available through other digital channels to figure out who may have been in contact with people. There were a series of interventions that we'll learn from South Korea that may be standing in contrast from, say, Italy. So point one is, you know, continued learning and a commitment to sharing in the public health community. That does require, you know, some degree of international frameworks for collaboration. And science has been an area that's been pretty successful there, and we could do more, number one. Number two, there's an issue of trust. I think a great deal of anxiety will be focused on China and whether it shared or didn't share early enough information, whether it's accurately reporting its counts today or not. Trust is point number two, and that does speak to more multilateral negotiations to make sure that we have a baseline comfort for what we're going to do or not do. I can give you an analogy. On the sidelines of the UN, President Obama launched something called the Open Government Partnership, which was signed by over 70 countries, I think, over the last 5 years. And there's been an agreement, as an example, of kind of a baseline standard for reporting on EITI, how to get information about what we're doing to extract minerals and other energy-related items from the ground. And so we've got some consistency in reporting around the world. Maybe there's a public health equivalent to get baseline statistics, even if some of those early findings might be difficult for an economy in a given country. But then third, I do think we're going to have this global haves, have-nots. Most of the analytic horsepower, most of the applications, most of the sort of first and second wave of the internet economy were powered by American interests and American businesses. And there's an open question as to how we engage in the use of our resources to help countries all over the world that may have limited capacity. And so what is our level of engagement? Are there opportunities to thoughtfully introduce more local capacity in these tools that continue to allow America to thrive economically? How do we strike the balance? Those are some of the questions that will follow as we think about the global nature of these pandemics.
Thank you, Anish. And Carla, I'm going to bring you back in. So Anish mentioned as a second point this issue of building trust. And when it comes to both fighting the pandemic and sort of the deployment of new artificial intelligence tools, there's issues with sort of fostering the level of trust necessary to optimize their usage. What do you think is needed to build this trust? And I presume issues like privacy, security are a major part of this trust building. So just wanted you to sort of answer this issue of how do we build trust in AI tools, especially in the context of the pandemic?
Well, we really applaud global efforts, again, things like the OECD principles on
Right.
AI that touch on, these really critical issues around bias, ethics, explainability, transparency, things that are very important. And we support, efforts to, again, have harmonized approaches to deal with these really critical issues. We also advocate for being ethical by design and really being critically thoughtful about these things at every step of the development process. And that's something that we're committed to as a company. We have talked a lot, and Anish and Mark have both sort of touched on this, that you can't really separate these issues into different silos. You can't talk about data without really touching on data ethics. You can't talk about AI without talking about the ethical issues, and there's a lot of overlap. And we haven't really even touched on the security piece, which is obviously one of the major concerns and one of the things that leads to people not feeling trust, because we've seen breaches and things like that that have terrible repercussions. And when you're talking about healthcare data, and anything healthcare related, and you with AI, you could even be talking about something implanted in someone's body. It's even more critical. So we feel like this is something that we have to get right, as an industry, but also just as a broader sort of ecosystem in terms of dealing with these issues. So we know that lots of companies have sort of come out with ethical principles and things like that, but we think that we really need a holistic approach to dealing with these challenges. And I think that what we're seeing with the pandemic and the burdens that it's placing on people really just indicates how we've got to get this right. And I just want to very quickly touch on something else Anish mentioned about, people faxing in, information, and the burden that this kind of, lack of digitalization places on our frontline healthcare workers. And that's something that we're obviously all very concerned about in a pandemic. And so we want to make sure that we're, able to fully maximize AI and really the full gamut of digital technology, so that we aren't asking healthcare workers who are doing unbelievable things to also then have to send in faxes and, transcribe paper reports and things like that. So we really do need to get the ethical pieces right, so that we can have full uptake of digital technology to support not only the people who are benefiting in terms of the healthcare recipients, but also to protect our frontline healthcare workers.
Right, a very important point. So I'm going to expand this question beyond just the pandemic, because the topic is sort of AI and innovation more broadly. Though in the context of the pandemic, a lot of the issues sort of get highlighted more. Mark, next question's for you, and I'm going to let Anish and Carla both jump in if they want to. What can the government do more broadly when it comes to fostering AI and AI innovation to sort of I guess my broader point was, how can the government foster more AI innovation? We talked about data sets, computing power, asking the right question, a skilled workforce. As someone who has both worked at AI companies or ran an AI company and invested in them, what are the resources that are necessary to make sure AI can succeed and help innovate?
So this will be a good, I think, triple hit here, because I think all three of us are going to be able to jump on this one. I was actually, before I start my answer, I was thinking when Carla was talking about intellectual property. I'll bet that there's a bunch of people at J&J that are walking around thinking, okay, we need to share what we discover. We need to, but where's the reasonable business expectation of intellectual property and ownership and stuff like that? I mean, these issues don't go away. I mean, any enterprise needs to. I mean, I know they are. It's just fascinating to see how we're all running into these issues because of the pandemic and kind of in real time. But to the larger point, John, about what can government do? I think there are lessons in the past. Whether he invented it or not, and Al Gore, by the way, never said I invented the internet. But I mean, certainly we can look back at the government platform and government behavior and government funding of what is now the internet, a platform that we are sharing right now, just magically. And if you go back not that many years, this would have been like a magic trick for us to be able to enjoy each other's video connection and to have, I guess, almost 80 people live and 150 people signed up and all that for a conversation. So the government had a wide variety of investments it made with no expectation of return. And that is the point I would stress right now, that my time at the Small Business Administration in the Office of Investment and Innovation, we handed out billions and billions and billions of dollars, tax dollars, every year as an investor with no expectation of return other than covering our low interest cost for those loans or those non-dilutive cash grants. And the 60% of the device I hold in my hand, it's called a mobile phone, 60% of the device I hold in my hand comes from the types of SBIC, SBIR, and other government grants for the basic technology that generates this device and a wide variety of other devices that we're using. In fact, the one I'm on right now, a laptop computer and a big screen. So the idea of investment in basic technology with no expectation of immediate return, which businessmen and women often have a much shorter time frame of expectation for immediate return, for intellectual privacy, for licensing and other enterprise behavior. But the government solely, I believe, in our domestic arena has the ability to invest with expectation of return that is quite modest, quite low. And its other expectation is that technology, once developed, maybe used by the DoD, maybe used by Department of Education or other agencies, is then shared. And I think I'll finish with this, which is, if I would argue with the participants today, if you hear one thing that all three of us are saying, it's sharing. That word applies for so many elements of what's going on today and tomorrow. And the government, I think, in prior lessons learned that I'm suggesting the internet is one of, when it invests and shares the effulgence, the impact, the value, the industries that are built upon that behavior are quite unique. So I think AI is just another example of that. But I'll also toss this in as a final thought. Unlike the internet, or unlike GPS, or unlike automotive standards, for instance, or unlike the interstate highway system that Dwight Eisenhower developed in the 50s, I think AI has a particular knife edge of danger in that the ability for AI to be wrong, but have a huge impact in a very short period of time over a wide variety of issues, unlike the interstate highway system or even the other stuff that I talked about. The AI has, I think, inherent dangers that we should pay a little more attention to as a society, both at the state, local, and federal level, going forward. But that's my answer, and I hope I answer your question.
No, thank you, Mark. And Carla or Anish, do either of you guys want to take a shot at that question? I can go with Anish first, or Carla. Sorry, Anish. Okay.
Well, I'll jump in. So I would just say, if we lift up for a moment, and Mark was sort of helping us do that, there is a formula for sort of American leadership on these industries of the future. And it basically follows the following, and I think it is a bipartisan formula, that in the US, we're at our best when we invest in that building block of innovation. And that building block would historically have been roadways, railways, runways, infrastructure. But in this environment where we're looking at artificial intelligence, it's really a digital infrastructure that needs to be part and parcel of it. So part of that is making sure we have the broadband capacity, the computing capacity, but it also means research and development. Now, it's an important statement here. What is the American goal for investments in research and development across the public and private sector that will ensure our continued leadership in industries that may be powered by AI and others? And I think, John, we're still at a 3% of GDP goal, and we're not there. We should be tracking and monitoring and debating how much of this should be investments made by the government, doubling down at the NIH and the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy, whereas incentives to the private sector to help drive private investment, whatever it may be, we have this base question: are we doing enough on research and development? I think if you benchmarked our investments in infrastructure with those of our economic competitors, you might say that in this chapter of AI or digitally powered industries of the future, it does appear that there are places around the world that are demonstrably exceeding the level of investment in research and development. Now, that's not specific applications, that's broad brush, the raw tooling that's needed, getting folks to think differently about how they solve problems by using these new techniques. Is a whole range of issues. So one is to get that R&D target. The second part of our framework when we make investments is then we got to have rules of the road. This is probably the area, John, that we have the most weakness right now. We don't have a national privacy law. We have not established what we would consider to be appropriate guardrails, even principles of guardrails. I would say the Defense Innovation Board, which was a relatively new creation inside the DoD, has done a thoughtful review. If you remember the brouhaha a year or two ago about whether AI deployed in the context of warfare is ethical or unethical, and whether Silicon Valley would or would not participate in those efforts, the Defense Innovation Board did a phenomenal job outlining the steps the Defense Department should take, but they are universal steps. And I would recommend everybody to take a look at those principles. But those are just guidelines. We lack any sort of formal regulated or through congressional effort judgments about what we can or can't do as a society. Every few years we have this debate. What should law enforcement have access to with respect to this information to keep us safe? What's a violation of our Fourth Amendment and our privacy rights? And we've kicked the can on, CALEA and all the other regulatory and legislative vehicles of the past because it's difficult. And so we've just got to find a way to do that. I do think there's a new dimension to this that may be above and beyond a simple privacy discussion or a government surveillance issue. And I've been thinking about this in the context of areas like COVID-19, and that is, what is the role of decision support, the net applications that come out? Should there be some obligation? We had a debate in the Obama administration around stockbrokers and their fiduciary obligations to individuals to make sure that the stocks or ETFs or whatever that were recommended were in the best interests of the person's retirement, not who had to pay the biggest commission to the broker. And in a way, if we think about the same artificial intelligence applications layer, what's in the best interests of getting us the vaccine as quickly as possible? Carla highlighted an example of the goodness that came out of this spirit of collaboration. We'll learn more as that unveils. But what happens if there are similarly alternative examples? We read in one of the recent Justice Department allegations of an electronic health records vendor that put, I wouldn't say it was AI powered, but some kind of decision support logic in front of doctors, directing them to prescribe opioids for patients, and might have contributed to this national crisis. It did use AI. It was powered by information technology. It suggested if you got back pain, take the drugs. But
Right.
the fiduciary guardrail that said, is this recommendation in the best interest of the patient? So we're going to have to do that last statement. If you've got the foundation, you got rules of the road, then there are all hands on deck moments when the country is called to action. How do we rein in healthcare inflation? How do we strengthen educational equity around communities that don't have access to broadband services and the like? And how do we think about next generation industries in space and others? And how do we use the public sector to drive some of those end applications in concert with the private sector? So long answer, John, but I think that's how we get the formula. Stick to our knitting, apply these principles in the world of AI, and we're going to be just fine.
Great, thank you, Nish. And Carla, do you have anything to add? What government can do to foster AI innovation? And before you answer, I'm going to open it up to Q&A soon. We have a few questions in the queue, but feel free to send more if you're in the audience. Zoom has a function for submitting Q&A, so use that. So after Carla responds, I'll take an audience question or two or multiple. So Carla, back to the original question. Yeah, what can government do to foster AI innovation?
Thanks, John. I'm fully aligned with what Mark and Anish laid out. Can't underscore enough about digital infrastructure, education. All of this requires a skilled workforce. Just a couple of things I think the government is doing well in the US. So coming out of the president's executive order, we saw guidance to regulating agencies about how they should approach AI regulation and really looking at it in the spirit of how do you facilitate innovation. And that's something that the US does very, very well. And there are other, governments and countries, particularly the EU, that have been very vocal that they want to sort of take the lead in terms of AI regulation and to sort of fill a vacuum, because the US does not have a big cohesive strategy. We don't have, as you said, even just a federal privacy approach. But what we do often bring to these conversations is, that lighter touch regulation, that risk-based approach, that look at how you can both innovate and regulate. And so I think if we can maintain that spirit, if we can look at it in a sense of guardrails, and then also think about how it impacts different sectors. We're all going to be using AI, for voice and facial recognition and in different new ways, but it's going to look different in healthcare versus finance versus other sectors. And so we should continue to be sensitive to that as we want to protect people and foster innovation at the same time. That's all I wanted to add to that.
Great, thank you, Carla. So we're going to take our first question. This is from Deborah Stein, who writes on science and technology issues. So her question, two-part question, what would you want the general public to know about AI in terms of how it's benefiting society today that might not be realized? And the second half, what should they worry about and not worry about regarding AI relative to what they hear in the media? So as probably all the panelists here know, the media sometimes sensationalizes certain things when it comes to AI, but they often get things right as well. So how do you differentiate those two? And I'll open this to whoever wants to answer. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. So Mark.
I'll be quick. Look, as I mentioned before, I read a lot of science fiction, and probably to my detriment, but if you read any science fiction or go to any science fiction movie or a movie that's oriented towards science fiction or the future, you leave very, very scared about AI. And I think that's Hollywood, and I think that's entertainment, is branding AI as a dangerous, dangerous thing. And you can take almost anything if you want to Hollywoodize it and make it a dangerous, dangerous thing. So I would counsel everybody, when you hear the term AI or machine learning, remember, intelligence is not artificial and machines can't learn. These are just programs that take data and create outcomes or predictive outcomes from the data sets. That's what it does. We've made a label on it that can be very, very scary. It is being used all the time in so many ways. I mean, just remember, when you go to the ATM and you punch in your code, it remembers how much you got last time, suggests what type of bill size you want, 20s, 50s, 100s, and even remembers whether you want it out of your savings account. This is sort of AI-ish, but things like that happen all the time in our daily life that we consider convenient. So AI and convenience are usually overlapped a lot. It's become scary because we're being shown examples, most of them fantasy, where it's gone completely wrong. Final point, though, is you've heard Carla, Anish, and a little bit of me, to some extent babbling, but those two more legitimately talking about standards and rules of the road.
Okay.
What AI is a giant shroud of technology behavior that, if misapplied and allowed to run unchanneled and untrammeled, could be scary, like Hollywood has made it. But right now, it's a good thing that's being used every single day.
Great. And Anish or Carla, do you guys want to take a stab at that question? Anish?
Wanted to say hi to Debbie, assuming it's the same Debbie that was our colleague at OSTP, and if so, nice to hear read your comments. I would just my general statement here is that the services that delight us, I think Mark had it best. It's an invisibility to the consumer that what makes that Google search work to help us find the information we need immediately is the underlying technologies that do that, or the delight we have now with the, some of the social media that, here's the compilation of your previous photos with your loved ones, and that magical Super Bowl ad that we saw where the kids were building that little tool for the grandparents, and sort of how some of that stuff's being automated. These are the delightful applications. I fear in areas like climate change, AI, these are absolutely critical areas of public policy and national competitiveness, but we struggle on the communications front without a clear path to get the broader community bought in, to hear those concerns and to address them. And I just acknowledge the fear and concern that the lack of understanding might actually hurt our long-term competitiveness if we don't figure out a way to communicate better on both of these critical areas and many others.
Thanks, Anish. And Carla, do you have anything to add, or should we move on to the next question? Next question. Okay. Okay, next question is from L. Cogliani. What is the single most important thing the federal government can do to improve data quality and accessibility? Also, is there a role for Congress, or do federal agencies already have the needed authorities? So raise your hand if you want to answer that. Anish, Carla, sorry, Carla, go first, and then Anish.
Well, I think one of the most important things that the US government could do is to pass federal privacy legislation. I think if we have a patchwork of different state approaches, some that are more like California, some that are more like, I don't know, Maryland or Washington State, like, we will be in serious trouble. It will inhibit our ability to do business. It will impact consumers in ways that they can't even anticipate yet. And I think it also just takes away resources, from other things, because it's unbelievably time intensive and costly to comply with all of these different things. So I think that's an important sort of first thing, not maybe responsive to your question, but what I'd like to see the federal government take on. And then I think just in terms of data, we need interoperability, we need standards so that the data, is consistent. In terms of healthcare, we need access to more data, whether it's EHR, death records. There's all kinds of data out there that we could use if we had access to it. And so we do need systems in place that will allow us to have access to that data. And so I think a thoughtful government approach to providing that access, and that's just one sector that I can speak to, I'm sure it's the same in other sectors, would be incredibly helpful. And we do have efforts going on, with NIST and others to develop standards, but the more that we can do to sort of have quality data on the front end, I think will speed up our ability to use that data and allow us to take resources away from, cleaning data and, all of the other different work that we have to do with various data lakes and things like that, and put that into, other uses of that secondary data.
I do believe we need a national privacy law. I couldn't agree with Carla more. I would just say I'm particularly frustrated on the issues of data quality, and let me share why. If you go back 10 years in the beginning of the HITECH Act, which is the portion of the Recovery Act that was used to digitize the health records, at the time, and I will remember this because he's a hero of mine, John Glasser, the former CIO of Partners Healthcare, was on loan to the government to guide us through this incredibly intense period of time. And John made a comment, at Partners, which is Mass General, Brigham, these are legendary institutions, on electronic health records for 30 plus years, right? They're supposed to be sort of an example of what we should do. He'd said quite candidly, I can't produce a list of patients who smoke. And that's not to say that somebody was bad or wrong or missed something. It's that wasn't what we were building in terms of documenting that in a structured format didn't materially affect how people got paid, what the reward systems were. So it was not a requirement in the base systems. One of the biggest complaints we got on the HITECH Act in the Meaningful Use program is that we finally sat down and said, look, at a minimum, you got to track the smoking status, the blood pressure, the medications list, the basic information in the medical record. We called it the minimum data set, the common clinical data set. The challenge was not to make everyone's lives a data entry nightmare at the front lines of medicine, but to ensure that we had the proper use cases in mind that would allow us to recover the investments we were making in these digital systems. So the secondary benefits of measuring quality and ensuring care coordination, and in this example, public health. So back to the number one recommendation, to me, the answer is alignment in the following way. If the Centers for Disease Control wanted to learn about the COVID cases immediately, that I would have presumed that step one, MacGyver style, would have been, how do I pull whatever I can out of the EHRs in a structured format and start with what we have and then supplement with the information we don't. If we had time to plan, and we have had a decade to think about use cases on the health information technology infrastructure, we should have anticipated the kinds of, the form that I read from the Centers for Disease Control was not some magical H1N1 / COVID-19 specific, technical, documentation issue. It's the patient's condition. Are they in the hospital or not? Basic things. So we could have incorporated those requirements this past decade. And so one of the challenges that I face is that when you go to the VA, when you go to the CMS, when you go to the CDC, and when you go to state, local, and private institutions that are looking for data, they're asking for what they need to do their job. But the linkage between what they need and what we're regulating as the minimum data set for the country, that seems to be a bit of a disconnect. And so we've got to do a better job of making sure moving forward that every agency starts with what they can collect out of the regulated systems, and then argue and debate what should the roadmap look like from here forward to get more granular requirements on cancer outcomes or whatever the circumstance may be whenever the issue arises. So this data quality issue ties with our regulations on what the data has to be at the source. But if the applications aren't part of that equation or not as well as they should be, we've got to close that gap.
Great. Thank you, Anish. Next question is from Addison Stark, who's actually one of my colleagues at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Do you see the potential in leveraging stimulus or recovery funding to develop a public option, in quotes, for computational resources for universities, startups, and other businesses? If so, at what scale should this be built out? So we talked about computational resources and the questions about sort of using public funding to sort of build this out. So raise your hand if you want to answer the question, and I can call on you. Mark.
So quickly, I think the short answer is a resounding yes. I almost invested in a company about a decade ago that made the following assertion that 85, this is before the cloud became a big deal, that 85 to 90% of what we had on our hard drives of our desktop or laptop computer was the same code that we didn't need to have on our hard drives. It's the use of what is now Microsoft 365 in the cloud and all that stuff. So it sort of predicted the cloud for access to data or content or functionality of programs or whatever. So I think there's a next step on that some huge percentage of computational power sits in silos called our laptops and our desktops. And now that we're interconnected in a way that is both trackable and faucetable, if that's a term, to me, there's no reason, assuming privacy and intrusion and hacking is kept inside the envelopes they should be, there's no reason we shouldn't be able to use the computing power that Intel has been making for our planet for the last 35 years, and now AMD, to solve the problems. You've heard it all now 7 times from all of us. Big data takes big comp, right? And without big computational power, big data is semi-useless. With lots of computational power, it is more useful. And with as much computational power as exists on the planet, it just shocks me we haven't figured out a way to do this.
Great. And anyone else want to sort of take a stab at that question, or should we go on? Okay, moving on to the next question. Actually, this question is for you, Mark. As a former SBA official, How quickly do you think they will be able to distribute the $350 billion loans in the recently enacted CARE legislation? So I guess this isn't particularly AI focused, but if you want to take a minute to take a stab at that, please go ahead.
Well, actually, I think it does have an AI element to it. Listen, I love my former colleagues. I love the Small Business Administration. It has been the sort of the redheaded stepchild of the federal government, in my opinion, for many, many years. It's done great stuff. My old area has done fascinating stuff, but it is my personal opinion that this will choke the engine of SBA belief and SBA behavior. The 7(a) program, most of you know, where the SBA guarantees a loan of a local bank to a small business that has been denied that loan. That's traditionally what happens. They guarantee you 85 cents on the dollar. Apparently, this administration believes they can ramp that up from $15 to $25 billion in guarantees on any given year to $350 billion in guarantees in 90 days. Last time I checked, that's a big difference. And I don't think that it's not a pejorative comment on the people. It's a comment on the process. And including the banks, I think makes it even more gummy, because banks are already showing that they're rolling back some of their perceptions of risk in how they're handing out smaller to mid-sized loans. This is cataclysmic to millions and millions of small businesses, and their capacity to apply for an SBA loan, wait 6 months for the local bank. And this is what used to happen. It's just not going to happen. So I believe, and I have some data to underlie this prediction, I believe that with Secretary Mnuchin or Secretary Ross, will find some way to convince the White House that they should be the pipeline that hands this money out. And final point, when you hand out that much money, you're going to have processes that are able to be abused by people that have nefarious goals. So I think that we'll discover later, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 6 months, that there is a lot of waste in this $350 million being handed out. But I would argue better some waste and saving your local deli and the nail salon down the street or whatever than trying to keep this under control and validate every single request, of which there will be hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of requests. Better to have some waste and solve the problem than keep it all pristine and not solve the problem.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Next question is about the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, also known as HIPAA. This act was passed in 1996 and designed to set rules around health information portability, security, and privacy. In the age of AI, does the law need to be re-examined in light of these new AI tools and techniques? And what safeguards should be put in place?
I'll jump on that. I mean, Carla may have an opinion about it. To me, this is one of the biggest areas, John, that I think we absolutely must tackle, and preferably in a vehicle, not to nudge you on the BPC side, but in a forum that brings sort of a spirit of collaboration to getting this right. I don't believe this is an ideological matter, but one of sort of acknowledgement that the capabilities and technologies have put us in a different place than the assumptions that led us when the legislators tackled it originally. One of the biggest issues right now is that we've made a judgment, pretty blunt instrument here, that if you quote unquote de-identify the health information at a source institution, it no longer is subject to HIPAA review or oversight. It's no different than Facebook data. A de-identified healthcare data set is the functional equivalent of an open data set. Now, I say that with a bit of alarm to mean that today, that de-identified data set is often sold. Patients may not be aware that their health information is organized in this way. When it was difficult to re-identify someone, the idea that, it's, affecting me or causing me harm might have been a different equation when it was written, 20 plus years ago. But in today's world, there are clear risks of relinking or unmasking. There are risks around undue harm. So we now, when people are mining this information for, looking for a cure for a disease, That's an obvious public good. But when they're looking to use it to deny you life insurance in a different way, that may be an area that has a bit more harm. So understanding the uses of the first, should the consumer be informed that their information is used in a de-identified manner? Should I be required to disclose that I'm selling it if I'm a hospital or a doctor? I think most patients would be confused if their doctor was selling their medical records in any format at all. And so does acknowledgement or transparency be something we have to do? Should there be limitations on the use of de-identified data or some constraint to make sure that it's, again, working in the best interest of the public? And are there, and I love Senator Maria Cantwell's framework for this, is there an idea of a commercial IRB, Institutional Review Board, that allows us to balance privacy and use at a more structured way on data sets, so that there is a judgment that says Carla's team at J&J should be able to tap public and private data sets to do the hard work that needs to be done to rapidly identify vaccines on this COVID crisis, and have that be a vehicle where we can actually get that decision-making done in the construct of a new privacy compact. I will say this, I'm involved in the Karen Alliance, which has had a debate about how do we add privacy protections in this world of consumer designated apps, which the interoperability rules basically bring a shot to the arm. And after a multi-stakeholder process, John, we reached the consensus that at a minimum, patients should be given disclosure as to whether or not the app developer intends to make even de-identified data available to third parties. And then whatever their policy is, whether they choose to sell it or not, or make it available for research, that there is some constraint on their vendor supply chain to honor the same rights. We have circumstances in healthcare where the hospital doesn't have a clue that they're selling the data, but the vendor that they signed an agreement with is pooling it with other resources and then making it available in this commercial way. So long-winded way of saying, John, I do think we need to revisit HIPAA in this era, not specifically to AI, but in the implications of how these new tools can take that old assumption and create more harm than positive.
Great, thank you. Carla, I'm going to let you respond to that, but before I do, we're almost out of time. So after you respond, Carla, I'm going to give the panelists a chance to give sort of like a super quick closing remark. And then I will sort of close the session. So with that, Carla, go ahead. And if you want to respond, please do.
Thanks. No, just very quickly, I think in addition to the fact that the data is used in different ways, and I've even heard people say that there's no such thing as sort of like you can always re-identify. We live in a different era, and so we have to be sensitive to that. We need to update and modernize our approaches, but also in terms of who's using the data, how we're defining the data. HIPAA's premised on covered entities and things like that that may not have the same resonance in the world in which we now operate. When you think about the Internet of Things and how accessible it is, and how we're even defining what healthcare data is. There's so much that's captured by your phone or your watch that can really be helpful. And so I think just taking a step back and looking at it broadly, in addition to the points that Anish raised.
Great, thank you. So last question, which will effectively be your closing remarks, and we're pretty much out of time, so keep this super quick. What's one thing you're most optimistic about when it comes to artificial intelligence? And the second part is, what is one key takeaway from everything you've said that you want people to remember? A sentence for each would be nice. And we'll start with you, Mark.
Can you say the two questions again?
Yeah, so in two sentences, one sentence for each, what are you most optimistic about when it comes to AI? And what do you want people to take away from what you've discussed today?
I'm most optimistic about education. I now I have a granddaughter, a grandchild, and I'm most optimistic is educated at both the high school, college, and beyond level, because AI, I think, will customize what she needs to know, what she wants to know, and how she applies her knowledge to her career and her life and her sense of happiness. So I think education is going to use AI in ways that I'm very, very, very excited about. The takeaway, I guess, the second question is just sort of what's a takeaway that you want from me?
Yeah, there's a sentence.
Well, I think if the movie, I think it was Aliens, the tagline was "Be afraid, be very afraid." Yeah. I think you've heard from everybody today, and I'll underscore, and maybe I'm over dramatizing this. I think we need adults in the room as this proceeds. And I just hope we have those adults moving forward.
Okay, so education is what you're most optimistic about, and having adults in the room is what you want your takeaway to be. Okay, Anish, what are you optimistic about, and what's your main takeaway from this discussion?
America's talent pool and leadership position on the industries and applications of the future. I am bullish on America leading in this chapter. And on the takeaways from today's session, we've seen with Carla's case study with J&J, there are immediate tangible benefits and many more to come if we get the rules of the road right. So that's my takeaway.
Okay, so talent pool is what you're optimistic about. America's talent pool and the rules of the road is what you want the takeaway to be. And Carla, I'll let you close with your remarks.
Yeah, I'm incredibly optimistic about the potential in terms of not just what we can do in terms of healthcare, but the way that we do it in really allowing us to be much more patient-centered, particularly something that I think we can be sensitive to now as we're sort of sheltering in place and what that means, and thinking about sort of how AI can help us connect with people. And I think my takeaway would be that we've got to have guardrails in place, and those guardrails have to be sensitive to ensuring that everyone is protected. And so that we are thinking about, issues like bias, issues like the digital divide, I think we're on the precipice of a point where we could have even bigger schisms in our society, or we can come closer together. And I hope that it's something that we are able to be sensitive to, so it brings us closer together.
Great, thank you, Carla. So optimistic got the uses in healthcare and guardrails is the main takeaway. And all three of you gave some version of the guardrails answer for your takeaway. So adults in the room, rules of the road, and guardrails. Okay, so with that, I want to thank you guys all for joining us as panelists. This was a very thoughtful discussion. I also want to quickly thank everyone who made this event possible, especially our colleagues at BPC, Nina Ladonia and Carolyn Cooper, as well as our vendors, Ventana. With this, we hope everyone has a sort of, great rest of the week, given the circumstances we're living in. We're living in obviously unusual times, and we need to pull together, but hopefully this conversation gave us some reason for hope. So thank you all, and hope to see everyone again next time. All right, bye.
Thank you.